We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Aleph in Mesechet Nedarim. This is Nedarim Daf 10a. The Gemara here continues, Afilu Tema Reb Yehuda. You can even say that our Mishnah follows the opinion of Reb Yehuda. Our Mishnah made a distinction between Neder and Nedava. It said that Nedava is something that even a righteous person, even a kosher person would do, but a Neder is not. And Reb Yehuda didn't make any distinctions between Neder and Nedava, and he just said that it's Tov, it's best if by a Neder you actually make the Neder and you fulfill the Neder. And the Mefarish over here says, Afilu Tema Reb Yehuda, he masnisin deshani bein Neder l'Nedava. Meaning our Mishnah, which makes a distinction between Neder and Nedava, it could be Reb Yehuda. To Reb Yehuda nami shani le, as the Gemara is about to say, Reb Yehuda also actually makes a distinction. V'chi ka'amer Reb Yehuda tov noder mishalem. And when Reb Yehuda said that it's best, it's good, if a person makes a Neder and fulfills the Neder, hainu damer b'loshen Nedava. He wasn't actually talking about a Neder, he's talking about a Nedava. He actually makes that exact distinction, the same distinction of the Mishnah, Avol beneder lo amr, but he doesn't say it by neder. Afilu Tamer Reb Yehuda, again, you could even say our Mishnah is Reb Yehuda. Ki amar Reb Yehuda ben Nedava. When did Reb Yehuda make his statement by a Nedava? Beneder lo amr. He never said that by a neder. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? V'hakatani, but the way he taught it was as follows. Tov mizeh mizeh, that the best scenario is noder umekayim. The person makes a neder and fulfills it. So you see, he is talking about neder and not nedava. And the Gemara says, Tani nodev umekayim. You should change the text. It should actually read nodev umekayim, and it's referring again to a nedava. The Gemara says, well, what's the difference? Ma'ishna noder delo. What's the difference that it's best to stay away from a neder? Dil ma'asi boli de takola, because maybe the person will come to a stumbling block. Nedava nami dil ma'asi li de takola. By nedava also, maybe there will be some kind of a stumbling block. Maybe you will not fulfill the nedava properly, or maybe you will use the animal which was supposed to be a carbon, you'll use it for something else, which would not be the appropriate thing to do. And the Gemara answers for that, Rabbi Yehuda l'taimi. Rabbi Yehuda follows his reasoning. The Yomar, because Rabbi Yehuda says, Oda mevi kivsaso la'azaru maktisha. The person brings his sheep or his lamb to the azara and sanctifies it. V'somech aleh v'shochta. He does smicha on it and he shechts it, and he does it immediately. So there's no issue over here, since he immediately brings it as a carbon. There's no issue that you're going to use consecrated property in an inappropriate manner. And the Gemara says, Teinach nedava de karbonos. That's a good answer in terms of the nedava of karbonos. There is something a person can do to avoid a stumbling block. But nedava de nazirus ma'ikol memra. What are you going to say by nedava of nazirus when a person decides to be a nazir? That also can come to a stumbling block. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehuda l'taime. No, Rabbi Yehuda follows his reasoning. The Tanyas we learned in a brayso. Rabbi Yehuda says, Chasidim harishonim hayu misavin lahavi carbon chatos. The original righteous people, the early righteous people, they wanted to bring a carbon chatos, but of course a carbon chatos can only be brought for a sin. How are you going to bring a carbon chatos if you don't sin? Lefisha ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu maybe takol al yedayim, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't bring a stumbling block through them. So maha yuosin, what did they do? Omdenu misnadvin, they would get up, and misnadvin nazirus, they would get up and they would volunteer to become nazirs. Lamakom to HaKadosh Baruch Hu kedei sheyischayev carbon chatos, in order to be chayev a carbon chatos, lamakom to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Mefarish over here says, L'fishena HaKadosh Baruch Hu maybe takol al yedein kilomar. What this means is as follows. What does it mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't bring a takol, a stumbling block, through these Chasidim Rishonim? Kilomar means to say, Shei mesiyarim shelo yasu shum chet v'rotzin lahavi karban l'schaper aleim. It means to say that they were afraid because they didn't want to do any sin, and they wanted to bring the carbon for an atonement in case they would do a sin. L'fishena HaKadosh Baruch Hu maybe takol al yedein mahayuosin, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't bring a stumbling block. They wouldn't cause a sin. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't bring a stumbling block through one of them. Kedei sheyischayev a carbon, in order that they be chayev a carbon. So what do they do? She'ein mevi'in carbon chatas el al chet mamish. You're really only supposed to bring a carbon chatas for a real chet, but they wanted to bring a carbon chatas, so to speak, just in case. In Yenacher, another way to understand this line in the Gemara, L'fishen HaKadosh Baruch Hu maybe takol al yadeim she'ein boin lidei shum takol v'shum chet she'ischayev a carbon chatas. The first explanation was, again, maybe something happened, they were afraid, and they wanted to bring the carbon chatas for whatever sin they may have caused indirectly. And the second explanation is, no, HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't bring any stumbling block through them. There was nothing they could bring. There was no sin they could bring a carbon chatas for, but they wanted to bring a carbon chatas. So what did they do? So again, as Rabbi Yehuda says, what they did was they were misnadev nazirus. They became nazirs in order to be chayav a carbon chatas, because a nazir does bring a carbon chatas. And the brayso continues, Rabbi Shimon has a different opinion what the Chasidim Harishonim did. Rabbi Shimon says, Lo nadru ben nazir. It wasn't that they volunteer to be a nazir. If somebody wants to bring a carbon ola, of course they can donate and bring a carbon ola. Shlamim misnadev umevi. Someone who wants to bring a shlamim can donate and bring it. Toda v'arba minei lachma misnadev umevi. The carbon toda and the 4 lechems, the 4 bread that go along with it, that also the person can donate and bring. Avol b'neziros lo hisnadvu, but they would not volunteer to be nazirs, kedei shelo yikru chotim, because they do not want to be called sinners. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, v'chiber olav me'asher chata ala nefesh, that it's a kapar, it's an atonement from the sin, and they didn't want to be called sinners, and therefore the Hasidim Harishonim did not decide to become nazirs. In any case, the point of the Gemara is that by nazirus, so they would volunteer to be a nazir. For this reason, the Hasidim Harishonim, even the people who were righteous, who were kosher, would volunteer because they wanted to bring a carbon chatos. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, Shimon HaTzadik v'Rebbi Shimon v'Rebbi Elazar HaKafar, Shimon HaTzadik and Rebbi Shimon and Rebbi Elazar HaKafar, Kulon Shita Achas, saying they all agree in principle on the same idea, the Nazir Chote Havid, that a Nazir in some way is a sinner. And what the Gemara is referring to over here is that the Gemara said earlier about Shimon HaTzadik, that Shimon HaTzadik would never partake of the carbon of a Nazir that became Tameh, meaning to say he had a concern in such a situation, the person might regret it, and there might be a sin involved. And Rabbi Shimon, we just quoted, Rabbi Shimon also says that people who were Hasidim Harishonim, they didn't want to volunteer to be Nazirs because they didn't want to be called sinners, so he also seems to say that a Nazir has some concept of sin. And then, of course, there's also going to be Rebbe Elazar HaKafar, who's going to be quoted momentarily. But again, they're all Shita Achas, that a Nazir is a Chote Have, Shimon HaTzadik, Rebbe Shimon, Hadi Amran. Shimon HaTzadik and Rebbe Shimon, like we just said, like we just quoted. Rebbe Elazar HaKafar, Berebbe, and Rebbe Elazar HaKafar is the following, the Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa. Rebbe Elazar HaKafar, Berebbe Omer, Rebbe Elazar HaKafar, Berebbe says, V'chiber olav me'asher chata ala nefesh, it says that it's a kapara from his sin. He brings this carbon chatos as a kapara. V'chiber ezu nefesh chata. What was the sin that a Nazir did? The reason why it's a sin is because he put himself in pain by depriving himself of something that was really mutter, and that was the wine. He's depriving himself, and that's considered a sin. And isn't it a kal v'chomer? If this individual, all he did wrong was he deprived himself from wine, and he's considered a sinner. If somebody deprives himself from everything, certainly that person is a sinner. Mikan, and from here we learn, anybody who sits and fasts voluntarily, that's called a sin. But the Gemara continues, but isn't this pasuk written by a Nazir that becomes impure? Talking about this pasuk of V'chiber olav me'asher chata ala nefesh. This pasuk that was quoted by Rebbe Elazar HaKafar Berebbe, that pasuk that mentions sin is talking about a Nazir tamei. And so therefore, how do we apply that to all Nazirs? And the Gemara answers, Mishum Deshana B'cheitu. The reason why it's written by that particular kind of Nazir is because that Nazir has a double sin. He repeats a sin. Not only is he a Nazir, he's also a Nazir Tamei, but in fact it is a sin to just become a Nazir voluntarily. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ha'omer konem konech kones Hare elu kinuyin lekarbon. If someone uses the word konem or konech or kones, those are substitute words for carbon. Again, like we said, you use the word carbon in order to create this neder to make something prohibited. This item is like a carbon to me. But even these substitute terms, like we said in the opening Mishnah of the Mesechta, substitute terms can also count and create the prohibition. And again, konem, konech, and kones, those are substitutes for the word carbon. Cherek, cherech, cheref, hare elu kinuyin lecherem. The words cherek, cherech, and cheref, those are substitute terms for cherem. Nazik, nazich, pazich, hareyelu kinuyin lenazirus. These terms nazik, nazich, pazich, these are all substitute terms for nazirus. Shavusa, shekuka, noder b'mohi. And shavusa and shekuka, and somebody who takes a neder b'mohi. We're going to see that mohi is a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. So those also hareyelu kinuyin l'shvua. Those are substitute terms for shvua, for the word shvua, which is an oath. And the Gemara says, Itzmar, we have the following machlokas amoraim. Kinuyin, when it comes to these substitute terms, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Lashon Umosein. Rabbi Yochanan says these were just foreign languages. They're words that were spoken in other languages that are used for these other terms. So konem is a word in a foreign language for carbon. And again, that's why it counts, if you say these terms as well, it counts as a neder. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, Lashon shebadu lahem chachamim lios noderbo. No, this is a language formulated by the chachamim that can be used for a neder. It wasn't a foreign language. The chachamim actually came up with these terms and said that these terms count as well. V'chein hu omer, and likewise it says in the pasuk, the Gemara here is just addressing the wording of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, bodu. It says in the pasuk, b'chodesh asher boda milibo, the chodesh, the month that he invented. It's talking about the fact that he invented a holiday in a particular month. So the point anyway is that the word bodu and shebadu, those are the same terminologies. And the Gemara says, "V'taima mai takinu rabbanan kinuyin." So, what was the reason why the Rabbanan instituted this concept of substitute terminologies? Delo lema carbon. So that way, the person, when they make the neder, they shouldn't say the word carbon, and instead of saying carbon, they'll avoid the word carbon and they'll say these other terms instead. And the Gemara says, "V'lema carbon." Why not say carbon? Why would we say, according to Rav Shimon Lakish, why would the Chachamim make these terms and say try to avoid the word carbon instead of say this? What's the reason you can't say carbon? And the Gemara says to that, "Dil ma'amar carbon laHashem." The reason is that we're afraid the person is going to say carbon laHashem, is going to use Hashem's name. Gemara says, "V'lema carbon laHashem." What's wrong with that? Let the person say carbon laHashem. What's the difference if he uses that terminology? And the Gemara says, no, dil ma'amar laHashem v'lo amar carbon. What if he reverses it? What if he says laHashem first and doesn't say the word carbon, never really finishes his neder, and never makes the neder? And then what's going to end up being is that the person is going to say the name of Hashem, the name of heaven, in vain, and so we want to avoid, it's very easy to say the word Hashem, to say Hashem's name rather, when you say carbon, and so therefore to try to avoid saying the word carbon, we had these other terminologies. Betanyan, we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, and we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Amud Beis.